The desert evening lay stretched thin across the American frontier, painted in cracked shades of red and dying gold. The earth was dry enough to split under a boot heel, and the wind came crawling low, dragging dust behind it like a long, whispering veil. Far off mesas glowed under the last breath of sunlight, while shadows crept out of canyons like old spirits taking their places for the night. Coyotes yipped somewhere in the distance, soft, cautious, as if even they respected the silence of Red Valley at dusk. And over it all, the narrator's voice seemed to drift like a memory. Some men are born loud, others, God made quiet so their thunder arrives later. In that fading light, Elias Ward moved with the slow certainty of a man who had spent more years in the desert than the desert could remember. He was a horse doctor by trade, though most simply called him Old Elias, the quiet fellow who lived past the ridge in a weathered cabin leaning slightly to one side. He wasn't tall, nor broad, nor the type to command a room. His hair had turned silver before his time, his hands were rough from a lifetime of stitching wounds and soothing frightened animals, and his voice, when he bothered to use it, was softer than cottonwood snow drifting in the spring. He avoided conflict the way others avoided rattlesnakes. When men argued in the saloon, Elias stepped outside. When tempers rose in the marketplace, he quietly guided his mule around the commotion. Most in town thought him harmless. A few thought him simple. And some, usually after a few drinks, muttered that men like Elias survived only because trouble didn't consider them worth the bother. But there were others, usually those with sharper instincts, who watched him just a moment longer than necessary, who noticed the grace in his movements, the way his eyes scanned the horizon, or how he never sat with his back to a door. Whispers floated through Red Valley. He traveled with tribes once, learned their ways, maybe even fought beside them. But no one ever asked him outright, and Elias never offered the truth. Long before the whispers began, there had been a day burned into Elias's memory like a brand on fresh hide. Back then, he was younger, stronger, and carried far more pain than peace. As he wandered a stretch of dry land between two rivers, he came upon a small tribe, peaceful people who lived light on the earth. Their camp had been struck by fever. 2 young girls lay weak, half delirious, their breath shallow, their skin hot as a branding iron. While the tribe's healer had knowledge of roots and smoke, the sickness was beyond them. And so Elias stepped forward. He remembered kneeling between the girls, mixing herbs with boiled stream water, using clean cloths and whispers of encouragement. He watched over them through 2 nights, refusing to sleep, cooling their brows and checking their pulses. On the 3rd morning, their fevers broke, and the camp released a collective breath that seemed to lift the very air. Their father, a tall, solemn warrior named Gray Hawk, stood before Elias with pride and gratitude shining beneath his stern expression. "A man who saves daughters," Gray Hawk had said, placing his hand on Elias's shoulder, "saves a nation. Our debt will echo." Elias's heart carried those words for years, and though he eventually moved back toward the settlements, he never forgot the tribe, or the weight of what he had been promised. But Red Valley was changing now, in ways Elias recognized all too well. Trouble arrived one sweltering afternoon in the form of the Bledsoe brothers, a gang of 5 outlaws with dust-coated hats, cruel eyes, and the kind of swagger that meant they owned everything they touched. They came into town loud and laughing, breaking the peace like a stick under a boot. By sunset on their first day, they had harassed a shopkeeper's wife, cheated a group of miners at cards, and beaten a ranch hand so badly the man couldn't stand without help. The sheriff tried to act tough for an hour or two. Then he saw the look in Hank Bledsoe's eyes, the oldest, the meanest, and the one with a scar that ran from temple to jaw like lightning frozen in flesh. After that, the sheriff decided sudden paperwork required his constant attention. Folks stopped expecting the law to do anything at all. Elias stayed clear of the gang, stepping aside when they walked the street, taking back routes to his ranch, and lowering his hat whenever he sensed them near. But men like the Bledsoe brothers always noticed silence, noticed weakness, and Elias's quiet nature drew their curiosity like vultures drifting toward a slow-moving shape. A rumor soon found its way to their ears, one that slithered through the saloon like smoke. Some old-timer mentioned Elias had once worked military jobs, maybe scouts, maybe medics, maybe something darker. And with such work, the men must have walked away with more gold than a simple rancher should ever need. Gold he kept hidden. Gold only a fool wouldn't spend. Gold worth killing for. The moment that rumor reached the outlaw's table, something ugly flickered in Hank Bledsoe's gaze. Men like him didn't care whether a story was true. They cared only whether it was profitable, whether it gave purpose to the violence already burning in their blood. They decided they'd pay Elias Ward a visit. Not to ask. Not to negotiate. But to take. Elias sensed it before it happened. It was in the way townsfolk looked at him pityingly when he passed through the general store. In the whisper of wind that felt colder against his skin that evening. In the way his horse stamped anxiously in its stall. Trouble was coming. Footsteps in the dust. Storm clouds forming beyond the horizon. And yet Elias remained calm. Almost too calm. As if he had expected this day to find him eventually. As if the desert itself had whispered a warning. Or perhaps, because he knew something the outlaws did not. Something old. Something promised. Something that echoed still. The cicadas had begun their nightly chorus, a rattling hum that rose and fell like the breath of the land itself as the last traces of sunlight stretched long across the earth. Elias Ward stood beside his small ranch house, brushing down his mare with gentle, rhythmic strokes. The dying light cast deep amber over the corral, turning dust motes into drifting sparks. Shadows crawled across the yard, lengthening, merging, and gathering in places that had no business holding darkness so early. Elias felt something tighten in his chest, a silent warning carried on the cooling air. But he kept grooming the horse, his hands as steady as ever. The crunch of boots on gravel came first. Then the low snicker of men who enjoyed being feared. Elias turned slowly, his body calm even as his heartbeat quickened. The Bledsoe gang stood like a pack of wolves surrounding a lone deer. Hank Bledsoe led them, tall and mean, his scar catching the last sliver of sun and glowing pale against his dirt-caked cheek. His pistol was already raised, aimed squarely at Elias's chest. "Old man," Hank drawled, his voice dripping with contempt, "hand over the gold or we'll bury you in your own barn." Elias took in the scene with one slow blink. 5 men, all armed, all confident that violence would bend him. He didn't raise his hands, didn't step back. Instead, he let out a breath barely noticeable in the cooling air. "I don't have what you're looking for," he said quietly, his voice steady as stone. The gang scoffed. One of them spat a glob of chew into the dirt, smirking as it splattered near Elias's boot. They closed in tighter, their footsteps stirring the dust into a lazy swirl. Elias didn't flinch. He met Hank's eyes with a calmness so firm it unsettled them for half a second, just long enough for irritation to twist into something sharper. "The desert ghost speaks," one outlaw jeered, shoving Elias hard in the shoulder. "Thought he was mute." Another man laughed. "Ain't mute. Just dumb." They shoved him again, rougher this time, but Elias didn't react. His silence annoyed them more than any threat would have. Without warning, 2 outlaws grabbed his arms, yanking them behind his back. A coil of rough rope scraped against his wrists as they bound him tightly. Elias stumbled but kept his balance, feeling the familiar bite of rope against skin. They dragged him forward across the dirt, toward the small house he had built with his own hands. In the doorway, Elias felt the wood scrape his shoulder as they shoved him inside. A table leg clipped his knee, sending a dull ache upward. The bruises forming beneath his shirt pulsed in time with his heartbeat, but he remained silent, his face unreadable. As the gang spread out through the house, overturning chairs and kicking aside his few possessions, Elias let his eyes drift to the corner where a small carved figurine sat half buried in dust, a horse made of juniper wood, the last thing his wife had shaped before sickness carried her away. The sight cracked something inside him, but still he did not speak. His thoughts turned inward, drifting through memories that smelled of smoke and prairie grass. He remembered the weight of his wife's head on his shoulder as they watched storms break across distant mesas. He remembered the night she died, his hand shaking over her frail frame, whispering promises he failed to keep. After losing her, he had vowed never to let anger govern his actions again. He had seen what rage did to men, how it carved them hollow. Peace had become his shelter, healing his purpose, violence his last resort. Now, with ropes cutting into his wrists and boots thudding across his floorboards, he closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not for mercy, nor for rescue, but for the outlaws themselves. "Forgive them," he murmured under his breath. "They know only hunger and fire." Hank Bledsoe stormed back into the main room, his face twisted with frustration. "Where's the gold, old man?" he snarled. "You were army, scout, doctor. Men like you don't walk away empty-handed." Elias lifted his gaze, the flicker of sorrow in his eyes mistaken for fear. "I walked away with nothing worth stealing." "Wrong answer." Hank kicked over a shelf, sending jars rolling across the floor and shattering. One outlaw ripped open Elias's cabinet doors. Another began slicing open bedding with a hunting knife. Elias watched them tear apart the fragile remains of his quiet life, each rip and crash echoing like a blow to the chest. But the moment one man stepped outside toward the barn, carrying an oil can and a wicked grin, something inside Elias snapped like dry timber under weight. "Leave the horses alone," Elias said sharply. The room froze for a moment, not because the words were loud, but because they were filled with an edge no one had heard from him before. It was enough to make the outlaw by the doorway chuckle. "Ben in the barn might warm him up," he said. "Maybe he'll talk then." Elias's jaw clenched. His heartbeat no longer slow and measured, but thudding with a long-buried force. He shifted his weight, testing the rope. Pain sparked where his wrists rubbed raw. His breathing steadied, not to calm himself, but to plan. In the chaos, no one noticed a tiny bulge under his shirt near his ribs, a small leather pouch tied with a thin strip of hide. Inside it lay something no one in the valley knew he carried, something older than a gun or blade, something gifted to him long ago by hands painted with tribal earth. He moved slowly, subtly pressing his fingers against the pouch until he felt the familiar shape of the small bone flute. Gray Hawk's daughters had given it to him the night he left their camp. "Play it," the younger had whispered, "if you ever need us." He had hoped never to, but the barn was seconds from becoming a bonfire, and the world was narrowing into a corridor of smoke and inevitability. With a quiet exhale, Elias twisted his wrists hard, feeling the rope burn deeper into his skin. It was enough. The knot loosened just a fraction, giving him room to slip his fingers into the pouch. The outlaw closest to him turned at the slight movement, but too late. Elias raised the flute to his lips, his hand still bound but steady. A thin, piercing whistle escaped, high and sharp as a hawk's cry cutting across the valley. The sound didn't seem like much, just a single note carried by the cooling desert wind. The outlaws burst into laughter. "That it?" one snorted. "Calling the coyotes to save you." Hank shook his head, grinning with triumph. "Let him whistle. Ain't nobody comin', Dot." But Elias didn't laugh. And far beyond the hills, where desert shadows hid secrets older than the town of Red Valley itself, something began to move. A stillness settled over the ranch in the seconds after Elias's whistle faded, a silence so complete it pressed against the ears. The outlaws' laughter died off slowly, as if their instincts warned them the joke had taken a turn they didn't understand. A breeze slipped through the yard, brushing against the dry brush beyond the fence. At first, it looked like nothing, just a shift of wind stirring the sage. But then the brush trembled again, this time against the direction of the breeze. Subtle. Intentional. Wrong. One of the younger outlaws stiffened. What was that? No one answered. They simply turned their heads, squinting into the deepening dusk, where the desert lay wide and open. Something moved again, low, deliberate, gliding along the ground like a shadow with purpose. The horses in the barn snorted and shifted nervously. Even the cicadas quieted, as if nature itself sensed an arrival it dared not interrupt. Hank Bledsoe tried to mask his unease with a scoff. "Probably a coyote. This old fool's whistle ain't callin' no savior." But then it came, a sound that did not belong to the living earth, nor to any creature of fang or claw. It rose from the canyon beyond the ridge, beginning as a distant thrum, and growing into a raw, spine-jolting cry that rolled across the valley like thunder cracking the sky open. A war cry, ancient, fierce, and filled with the deep promise of retribution. The outlaws froze, their boots rooted to the dust. Their eyes widened in the waning light. "What the hell was that?" another outlaw whispered, voice tight and shaking. No reply came, because even Hank Bledsoe had gone pale around the edges. Men like him feared nothing they could see, but things they couldn't name always carved deeper fear. From the rising shadows beyond the fence, figures emerged, first one, then two, then half a dozen. They moved like ghosts, their steps silent, their faces painted with earth colors that made them blend with the land itself. Gray Hawk led them, tall and steady, his braids tied with feathers that caught the starlight now piercing the twilight. Beside him walked warriors with bows drawn, spears ready, and eyes sharp as obsidian. Their presence changed the air. The ranch no longer felt like the outlaws' playground. It felt sacred, guarded, transformed by something older than the greed that brought them here. Hank stumbled back a step. Don't shoot yet," he muttered, though his own hand trembled around the grip of his pistol. But fear makes fools reckless. One outlaw panicked first, firing a wild bullet into the darkness. The shot cracked through the night, ringing off the canyon walls. In the breath between echo and silence, 3 arrows sliced through the air. Swift, silent, precise. One arrow pinned the shooter's hat to the barn wall, missing his skull by an inch. Another snapped the gun from another outlaw's hand. The third struck the ground at Hank's feet, quivering like a rattlesnake tail daring him to move. The outlaws broke into chaos, firing blindly toward shadows they couldn't track. But the warriors moved too quickly, slipping between the dark and the dust with lethal grace. Arrows whistled past Elias as he lay tied on the ground, but none touched him. The warriors were precise. They aimed only to disarm, disable, control. The first outlaw fell when a warrior swept his legs out from under him with the butt of a spear. Another stumbled backward, dropping his rifle when an arrow cut across his sleeve. The gang tried to regroup, shouting orders drowned by panic, but the warriors had encircled them fully now, tightening like a woven snare. Elias watched with a mixture of awe and agony. His wrists throbbed where the rope burned into his skin, but his eyes were bright, fixed on the men who moved through the night with a fluidity that made them seem mythic. Dust swirled around them in spirals, carrying the scent of earth and sweat and vengeance fulfilled. Gray Hawk stepped forward, spear angled downward, not threatening, but commanding. He looked at Elias with the same solemn recognition he'd carried years ago in the tribal camp, when the fever finally broke and his daughters breathed freely again. He placed a hand over his chest in a gesture of gratitude. "You saved our daughters," he said softly, though his voice carried like rolling thunder. "Today we save their friend." Elias felt a tightness rise in his throat. Old memories, old bonds, old debts woven together by fate and time. He bowed his head slightly, acknowledging a promise kept on both sides. 2 warriors knelt beside him, cutting the ropes cleanly with obsidian blades. Elias winced as blood rushed back into his hands, but he didn't complain. Instead, he stood slowly, watching as the last of the outlaws was forced to his knees. The fight was over, swift, controlled, decisive. Yet Hank Bledsoe was still standing, though barely. One of the warriors had caught him across the back with a blunt staff, leaving him hunched and gasping. His pistol lay forgotten in the dirt. His eyes darted wildly between Elias and the warriors, as if trying to reconcile how a quiet, aging horse doctor had brought such wrath upon them. Then he saw it, the edge of Elias's sleeve torn during the struggle. Just enough fabric had shifted to reveal the markings inked into his skin, tribal symbols, a hawk feather, and the intertwined lines of unity between nations. Hank's breath hitched. You rode with them," he whispered. Hell, you were one of their scouts. A bridge between worlds." Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth lay bare. Elias hadn't always been the quiet healer tending horses in Red Valley. He had once been a man who stood between violence and peace, guiding settlers and tribes alike, choosing diplomacy over bloodshed whenever possible, but fighting when the land demanded it. A man who carried 2 worlds on his shoulders until the weight of war cracked something inside him. A man who walked away not from fear, but from sorrow. His silence had never been weakness. It had been a choice. Gray Hawk stepped beside Elias, nodding with pride. "He walked away from battle to heal," the warrior said, his gaze locked on Hank. "But that does not mean he stands alone." The remaining outlaws, shaking, defeated, disarmed, were gathered by the warriors and bound with their own discarded ropes. Hank was forced to his knees, his hands tied behind him, his face pressed into the dust he'd once strutted over. The warriors didn't kill him. They didn't even strike him again. Instead, they tied him securely to one of Elias's fence posts and stepped back. Gray Hawk pointed to him as though marking a final boundary. "Leave him," he said. "Let the sheriff choose whether he is law or coward." Elias exhaled a slow breath, feeling both heaviness and relief settle through him. The battle was done. Justice, not vengeance, had been served. And the warriors turned from the ranch, their figures dissolving once more into the brush, as silent in departure as they had been in arrival. Behind them, Hank Bledsoe knelt alone in the dirt, bound and trembling, facing a dawn he would not walk away from freely. The night after the battle settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket, carrying with it the smell of dust, broken wood, and trampled earth. Elias stood in the doorway of what remained of his home, surveying the splintered shelves, the overturned table, and the shattered jars glinting like shards of ice in the lantern glow. His horses paced anxiously in the corral, stamping at the ground, but they were unharmed, skittish, but alive. For Elias, that counted as a blessing. He ran his hand along the mare's neck, whispering something soft and steady until her breathing evened out. The desert wind brushed against him, cool and comforting, as though the land itself offered sympathy. By morning, word had raced ahead of the sunrise. When the sheriff rode into town with Hank Bledsoe bound in chains, a crowd gathered faster than ants to spilled sugar. People peered from porches, storefronts, and saloon doors, whispering in disbelief. Hank's swagger was gone, replaced by a bruised, trembling silence. The rest of his gang followed behind him, limping, defeated, and still stunned by the night's events. But what caught the town's breath wasn't the gang's capture. It was the murmur spreading like wildfire. Warriors, someone whispered. Actual warriors rode in to save Elias Ward. Another added, saw feathers and paint marks on the dirt. Never seen anything like it. A few dared to say aloud what had long been rumor. Elias wasn't always just a horse doctor, was he? By noon, Elias entered town to find all eyes drawn to him, not with suspicion this time, but wonder. As he approached the sheriff's office, the sheriff stepped outside, hat in hand, his expression caught somewhere between relief and shame. He cleared his throat, searching for words that refused to come. Elias spoke first, his tone calm but firm. "You saw what fear does to a men last night," he said, his gaze steady. "Hank bullied this town because he knew the law here was hollow. That ends now." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. The sheriff swallowed hard. I should have stepped in sooner." "You still can," Elias said. "Not because men like me or Gray Hawk show up, but because this town deserves someone who won't run from his badge." The sheriff looked down, the weight of Elias's words settling over him like sun on iron. Shame reddened his cheeks. "You're right," he said quietly. "I failed, but I won't again." The crowd watched this exchange in stunned silence, witnessing not just a confrontation, but a shift, something old giving way to something steadier. They had long believed Elias was weak, a quiet shadow on the outskirts of their world. But now the truth glimmered through the cracks of their assumptions. This quiet man had allies who rode like the wind, warriors who would risk their lives for him. And he, in turn, had risked his for the helpless before any of them ever noticed. After the sheriff led Hank inside to await trial, the townspeople gathered around Elias in a hesitant circle. Parents stepped forward first, their voices thick with emotion. "Thank you, Elias," one father said, "for standing up when the rest of us hid." Another nodded, gripping Elias's arm. "We owe you more than we can say." A small girl tugged gently at his sleeve. When Elias looked down, she offered him a bundle of wildflowers, purple lupin mixed with desert marigold. "Mama said you're brave," she whispered. Elias knelt slowly, taking the flowers with hands still healing from the rope burns. "I'm no braver than your mama," he said gently. "I'm just a man who tries to heal what he can." The girl smiled shyly before running back to her mother, leaving Elias with a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Gratitude washed over him, humble and sincere, but it was almost overwhelming. He didn't see himself as a hero. He never had. He only knew how to mend wounds, whether on horses, people, or the land itself. By afternoon, dust rose on the horizon. Elias knew that silhouette, the rhythm of those hooves, the shape of those riders against the bright sky. Gray Hawk and his warriors approached one final time, their formation calm and respectful. When they reached the ranch, Gray Hawk dismounted with a grace that made the earth seem unworthy of his steps. "You are safe," Gray Hawk said, placing a hand on Elias's shoulder. "And our debt is repaid." Elias smiled softly. "You didn't owe me anything to begin with." Gray Hawk's eyes held both gratitude and gravity. "You saved the spirits of my daughters. That is a debt that does not fade, even now." The warrior's gaze drifted over the broken boards, the scattered belongings, the scars of the fight. "You could come with us," he offered. "Leave this place. Join our people. We would welcome you as brother." Elias paused, touched by the honor. In truth, part of him longed for the serenity of tribal lands, the songs carried on the breeze, the harmony of people who moved with the world instead of against it. But his eyes traveled over his ranch, warm but familiar, stitched with memories of his wife, his patience, and the quiet life he had chosen after so much bloodshed. "This is my home," he said gently. "Broken or not, it's where I belong. There's still healing to be done here." Gray Hawk studied him for a quiet moment, then nodded. "Then we leave you with the strength of our ancestors. Call for us if ever the desert grows dangerous again." Elias lifted 3 fingers to his heart in a silent gesture of gratitude. The warriors mounted their horses once more, and as the sun dipped toward the horizon, they rode westward, their silhouettes fading into the golden blaze like spirits returning to legend. When their figures finally vanished, the land seemed to breathe, exhaling a long, dusty sigh that carried through the valley. Elias stood alone in the twilight, his home battered but standing, his spirit older but unbroken. Night crept in gently, wrapping Red Valley in cool blue shadows. The cicadas resumed their lullaby, soft and rhythmic, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. Somewhere, an owl called out from an ancient juniper tree. The wind shifted, carrying a faint whistle, not from Elias's flute this time, but from the canyon itself, as if remembering the promise carved into its stones. And in that moment, it felt like a narrator's voice rose with the breeze, whispering into the quiet desert air. They say the quiet man still walks Red Valley. And when danger rises, the wind carries a whistle that no outlaw survives.